Oh, YouTube, YouTube, YouTube. I've been up since 5 this morning. It's now late at night, but such is my devotion to you guys. Despite my tiredness, such is my devotion to my loyal viewership that I'm doing a video for you anyway. Today, we're tackling Sherlock Holmes. All right, so today I want to do my top 5 favorite Sherlock Holmes stories for you guys. I don't know if you've read Sherlock Holmes before, but if you haven't, you really ought to because he's brilliant. Creation of Arthur Conan Doyle, written in the beginning in the late part of the 19th century, running up through the 1920s. It was an immensely popular character, so much so that many people in England now think he was a real person. He was not a real person. He was a fictional character, but the subject of many great stories. So let's get right on rolling so I can get to bed with number 1. Number 1 is A Study in Scarlet. This is a little bit of a cheat because it's actually not a Sherlock Holmes short story. It's a novel. It's the first appearance of Holmes and Watson and all of your great friends, but I couldn't leave it out. It's brilliantly plotted. It's the introduction to the characters. You know, you get to learn all about Holmes and Watson for the very first time. You get to see how they meet. You get to see how this incredible couple come together, this partnership that will last for decades. They come together and they learn about each other. It's also interesting because there's some inconsistencies. Holmes's character is not fully developed yet. It changes a bit in later stories. Like there's a whole bit about how he disregards anything he considers inconvenient or irrelevant to the criminological field in which he wants to work. So he doesn't know that the Earth goes around the sun because he doesn't think it's relevant. So there's those huge gaps in his knowledge of things he doesn't think are relevant to crime fighting. But, you know, in later stories, those gaps would disappear, and he would, of course, know that the Earth goes around the sun, and many other things that would seemingly be irrelevant, but turn out to be surprisingly relevant because you never know. You never know when fighting crime what's going to come in handy. So it's a great story, very well plotted. You see a lot of Holmes's trademark deductions, and it's kind of spooky. It was cool. So number 1, Study in Scarlet. Boom. Moving right along. Number 2, A Scandal in Bohemia. Now this comes from the first collection of Sherlock Holmes short stories called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And the plot is a fairly standard blackmail case. Nothing too remarkable there, but the story is worth mentioning and makes my top 5 because it contains Irene Adler, the woman. Watson informs us that Holmes was very impressed with Irene Adler and called her the woman because she was the only one who ever outwitted him, the only one who ever beat him. In adaptations of Sherlock Holmes you may have seen in stage and screen and film and television, Irene Adler is always portrayed as this amazing mastermind who outwits Holmes at every turn and is his equal and is a worthy opponent to him. In the BBC version, she's like a dominatrix figure. In the story, she's not anything nearly so impressive. She's just a normal girl. She happens to pull one over on Holmes in a fairly clever but not too impressive way. She's never heard from again. You never see her in any other story. The movies make her out to be a much bigger character than she was in the stories. But I thought because of her importance in the Sherlock Holmes universe, in the whole mythology of it, I wanted to talk about A Scandal in Bohemia because that's where you meet her for the first time and only time in the stories. Next, I have The Final Problem. Number 3, The Final Problem. The Final Problem comes from a later Sherlock Holmes collection called The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And this was Arthur Conan Doyle's attempt to unsuccessfully kill off Sherlock Holmes. He had become so tired and fed up with the character. He said, I'm done. I'm killing him off for good. No more. But it turns out the public's demand was insatiable, and he was offered so much money that he had to keep writing these stories. So The Final Problem is notable for 2 reasons. The first is that Sherlock Holmes apparently dies in it, and the second is that it's the introduction of Professor Moriarty. Now, again, this is an adaptational thing that I think is interesting. In every adaptation of Sherlock Holmes, Professor Moriarty is his archenemy and is at the back of every crime he fights and shows up again and again and again. In the stories, Professor Moriarty only shows up ever twice, and the first time is very late in the final problem. And Holmes does say in the final problem that Moriarty has been at the back of every crime I've ever solved, but it's kind of forced, I mean, clearly he wasn't. He's really just kind of cooked up as a way for Holmes to have an equal, for someone to finish him off and kill him. But this is, if you are a Sherlock Holmes fan and you like the character of Moriarty, played so expertly, I might say, in the BBC version by an actor whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, but a masterful portrayal of Moriarty. Just wonderful. But he only shows up in 2 stories. The final problem is his most fleshed out appearance. And if you are a fan of Moriarty, you're going to want to read that one, even though he's not nearly as big a deal in the stories as he is in the movies and TV shows. Number 4, The Speckled Band. The Speckled Band is again from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And this is a real classic Sherlock Holmes story. Conan Doyle himself listed it as one of his very favorites, and I can see why. It's got everything you love about Holmes. It's got brilliant deductions. It's got a spooky old house. It's got a mysterious death. It's got Holmes and Watson staying up late all through the night in a room by themselves, locked in, to try to discover the identity of the murderer and what could possibly have happened. It's spooky. It's atmospheric. It's clever. It's got everything you want. It's got the great characterizations. The Speckled Band, number 4. Good choice. And finally, now this is a bit of a wild card here. It's my personal favorite, number 5. My personal favorite Sherlock Holmes story. But I never see anyone else talk about it. I never see anyone else bring it up on any list. It wasn't on Conan Doyle's personal favorite list, which I think is because the idea was suggested to him by a third party. I forget who, but it wasn't his own idea. But he did write it, and I think it's a wonderful story. It's again from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, and it's The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. The Copper Beeches is a sprawling estate, and the story is kicked off by a woman coming to Holmes and saying she's been offered this lucrative job as a nanny in this estate, but something's not quite right about it. There's something going on that makes her uneasy, and she wants Holmes to investigate. And it's got all these great Gothic tropes in it. It's very atmospheric. It's very spooky. There's a lot going on. The plot is very twisty and turny. There's all kinds of unexpected revelations that come into it. I just think it's a wonderful story. I love just the whole feel of it. It feels very Gothic. It's more Gothic than most of the other Sherlock Holmes stories, which a lot of them are very kind of hard-boiled criminal type cases. This one's a little bit more, I mean, it's not supernatural, but it has that kind of like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights kind of feel to it, which I really like. So my number 1 pick, which is number 5 in my list because I did them in that order, is The Adventure of the Copper Beeches from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And those are my 5 choices. Let me know what your 5 choices are. What are your favorite 5 Sherlock Holmes stories? Post them in the comments right down there. I'll be looking for them. I'll be trying to find out what my what my viewers think, because I care, guys. That's the kind of guy I am. I care. Right now, I got to go to bed. I'm exhausted. But thanks so much for watching. I've been Logan Albright, and you've been wonderful.